In the last episode, you said Enlightenment thinkers did not believe in natural law. Considering that our founding fathers were products of Enlightenment thinking, does this mean that they too rejected natural law? I was always under the impression that the founders did believe in natural law, as this is what conservative American political thought teaches. I've often heard conservative American thinkers contrast our founders' belief in natural law with modern positivist beliefs. To what extent did the founding fathers believe in natural law? Is the belief among many conservatives that the founders accepted natural law a flawed belief?
Well, that's a good question. A lot of them use the language of natural law. And you got to remember, too, when you talk about the Founding Fathers, you are not speaking of a monolithic block in terms of ideas or religion. They were very mixed. But deism was certainly present among them. Now, and certainly the most influential people like Jefferson. So what was deism? Well, deism, of course, is the belief that there is a God of sorts. He's a creator, but he set the world in motion and basically has nothing more to do with it. They believed in a natural law of a sort, people of this kind, but it was not the natural law in quite the same sense the Catholics thought of it. Depending on the thinker in question, natural law might simply be what is most suitable for the human being, however you want to define that. But the Catholic idea of natural law, which is basically the law that God has put in each of our hearts and that can be discerned without revelation, that's a very different concept to the idea of natural law that people like Jefferson and all had in common. For one thing, the Catholic view of natural law is that it's basically a foundation upon which the divine law can be built. But for people like Jefferson, the natural law was it. End of story.
Okay.
And you'll see this, part of the problem with a lot of these discussions is that various writers and thinkers use the same words to address rather different concepts. So, for instance, the common good is a phrase that you get heard a lot. You, for instance, would like to nationalize the means of production for the sake of the common good. But what does that mean? Now, for the Enlightenment thinker, the common good was simply the aggregate of the self-interests of society, of all the different people making up society. The common good was whatever benefited the most of them. But for the Catholic, the common good was quite literally that which was best for the community. In other words, for the Enlightenment thinker, the individual interests were paramount. And that's why the majority became so important for them, because obviously there was so much contradiction, somebody's got to be in charge. And the easiest way to do it is to count the number of snouts, and, there you go. But for the Catholic, the common good is something independent from the mere desires of the population. Very often the common good is something that they won't like, that the majority of people might not like. So, for instance, the abolition of pornography. Now, for the Catholic, the common good would require the suppression of pornography. But in the Enlightenment setup, if most people want pornography, and we know they do, then you keep it.
That's a good example.
Well, and it's an important one, because one of the arguments today between the so-called integralists and their opponents, who, I don't know, constitutionalists, libertarians, I've taken to calling them Murrayites after John Courtney Murray. But whoever they are, they would uphold the Founding Fathers' notion of the common good as against that of the Church. They would say that the problem with the Church's idea of the common good is that it leads to tyranny and fascism. because you're imposing a single view of the common good upon the majority. And you see, this is where the question it becomes so important. Who determines these things? On what basis?
Yeah.
And basically the Murrayite Catholic will say that the integralists are betraying the church's idea of religious liberty and so forth. And the integralists will reply that the Murrayite is betraying the church's entire tradition of social teaching.
Honestly, I think in our future, integralists are going to have to become champions of religious liberty out of pragmatism.
Well, I mean, that's what the church has always done in America.
Yeah.
But this is what brings us back to the original question. I forget if it was the pre-show or this show, but about evangelization and the problem of the country being ultimately religious. Because as long as it's divided into sects, there can be no agreement on the common good. There can be no agreement on the end of government. There can be no agreement on the end on natural law. You can't agree on those things because you're coming from radically different points of view. So religious liberty is what allowed the country to function. The problem is that in days gone by, although there were differing religious doctrines, there was a moral consensus. The vast majority of people, for whatever reason, and the reasoning behind it would be different. A Catholic would believe things were right and wrong for one reason, a Jew for another, a Protestant for another. They all had different reasons for believing it, but they arrived at the same conclusion.
Yeah.
But once that consensus was broken, well, that's when everything became a problem. And that's where we are now, because in the 50 years since the 60s, those varying visions of right and wrong have gotten ever further apart from each other. Until now, they're utterly irreconcilable. You know, at the end of the day, either we're murdering infants by the millions, or we're providing health care to women who need it. We're either allowing blasphemy and attacks on the integrity of the all-great God and his faith, or we're allowing artists to express themselves as they wish. Even if that means putting a crucifix into urine, well, that's the artist's right to self-expression. You see, these differing views become ever more separate. The only way, ultimately, that there can be true peace in this country is for one of them to prevail. Now, the downside is that if the other side prevails, it is not ultimately self-sustaining, because you cannot build anything on sheer negation.
Yeah.
You can't have a stable society built on families that aren't real. In the long run, it just isn't going to hold together.
Yeah.
So that's when you'll get something like Islam or some other animating principle that will say, no, this is, you see, the thing about Islam, like Catholicism, like Hinduism, like a lot of other faiths, is that it does deliver the bare essentials necessary for society to work. A strong family structure, a belief in a transcendence that inspires you to sacrifice yourself for it. You know, these are all the small things that every society needs to operate. Now, the reasons can be different. The ultimate end can be different. But you need these very small basic things to be somehow justified. And the problem with the American liberal construct, which is basically the Enlightenment taken to its ultimate end, to its reductio ad absurdum, is that you can't build on that. If society is nothing more than its individuals, each sovereign and able to do whatever they want to do, or even to reshape themselves if they choose, then society collapses. It cannot sustain itself. And this is why, I've said it before, I'll say it again, but I don't know that I've ever been this explicit, either in writing or vocally. But this is why attempting to evangelize their country, and that means their state, and that means their county, and that means their town, and that means their immediate circle, is not simply a religious duty for Catholics in America or anywhere or in any other heathen country. It is a patriotic duty. If you do not want to evangelize these United States, you are no patriot. You do not love your country. You may think you do. You may tell yourself you do. You can wave the flag and say, we're number one, and wear a MAGA hat, and you can do all that stuff, and that's nice, I guess. You could be out there on Memorial Day, you know, for the troops. You could tell every serviceman you meet, thank you for your service. You can send off the fireworks on the 4th of July. You do not love your country.
Okay. Kentucky traditionalist second question. In my last question, I asked about natural law as it relates to the Founding Fathers. How does natural law relate to the Founders' belief in natural rights? Will you explain the Enlightenment concept of natural rights? What does the Catholic Church teach about natural rights, and how do Enlightenment concepts of natural rights compare with what the Catholic Church teaches about the issue?
Well, basically, the Church teaches, and I'll deal with the Church's ideas first because they're older. The Church, they were the norm before the Enlightenment. The Church teaches that every human being has a certain dignity that comes to him by virtue of being a creation of God. So, with a soul that is redeemable. Now, that dignity is natural, it's purely natural, but it nevertheless pertains to him. So he has, freedom from being murdered, freedom from having his stuff stolen. He has all sorts of privileges and rights and freedoms that come to him from that dignity. Above all, he has a right to hear the salvific truth that will take him to heaven. The baptized individual, the supernatural man, he too has a dignity befitting his station, a member of a royal priesthood, etc., which is a higher dignity than that of the natural man. The natural man, of course, is fallen, and if he dies that way, well, that's the end of him. The supernatural man, if he perseveres, will spend eternity in heaven. It's a big difference. Nevertheless, in terms of governance, both types of man have very similar rights, etc. But error has no rights. So, the natural man or the supernatural man does not have the right, for instance, to preach, teach, or practice heresy. Now, this might be tolerated if to not tolerate it would bring about worse evils, if you see what I mean. To put this another way, I may have a right to your house. I may own it. But if I exercise that right and your aged grandmother is going to die as a result, then it's wrong for me to exercise that right. Because a greater evil will arise.
Yeah.
So, Uh, but all of these dignities that come to man, whether it be natural or supernatural, come to him purely because of his creation by God and because of the possibility of his eternal destiny. Thus, he has no innate right to do what's wrong, even if it's victimless. He has no right to prostitution. He has no right to slander.
Yeah, I know Pope John Paul, he said, freedom consists in the freedom to do what is good, not
Correct.
what is bad.
Correct.
And we've lost that.
Well, we've lost that because we have no one to determine, except the Supreme Court, of course. We have no one to determine what's good and what's bad.
Yeah.
And that takes us back to the Enlightenment. Because for most Enlightenment thinkers, what's good and what's wrong, what's bad, what's right and wrong is determined by the individual for himself. And so he basically has the right to do anything he wishes to, so long as it doesn't cause any public disorder. Or as they say, do what you want as long as it doesn't frighten the horses.
I've never heard that one before. Okay.
Well, you didn't hang around old people who would still be 100 years old if they were alive now. But the thing is then that you've got a very different set of views of rights. The Enlightenment basically made the individual primarily, and then secondarily what the local establishment would bear. In other words, they're not going to put up with you running naked through the street.
Yeah.
So you don't really have a right to that. Unless it becomes the norm, in which case you're fine. So basically you've got a right to whatever you can get away with. Is what it comes down to. And you're completely self-actualized, self-motivated. As I say, Kant, although pursuing a moral code of sorts himself, he was very clear that you have to pursue morality for its own sake and yours, not for any outside pressure.
Okay. What does that mean? I'm not sure. Not from any outside pressure.
Yeah, in other words, your moral code should be entirely your own and not dictated to you.
That I've never encountered this before, but to me that's lockstep with I forgot what I was listening to, but it was like freedom from parents.
Yeah.
Right?
Ultimately.
You can't get your moral code from your parents because that's what's the word? That's totalitarian. That's people are pushing their views on you, and you should be free to choose your own.
Yeah. Now, of course, the problem with that is where you're supposed to come up with these views from.
Oh, from state schools. That's the only place where freedom reigns.
Yeah, well, we'll see how long that lasts. Thank God they're locked down. So, I didn't say it made sense. I didn't say it worked. And what's funny is how long it took for that kind of thinking to become dominant. That's the funny thing to me. It's not that it is dominant. It's that it took it so long. Because the great thing about it is that it appeals to all the worst sides of human character.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, we all just want to let it all hang out. We don't want to have to be saying yes sir, yes ma'am. We want to do whatever we want.